started. Go ahead, Melissa, to slide 2. Oops, there we go. This slide is also elaborated in one of the handouts. If you have a moment and you want to see a little bit more, go ahead and open that up and look at it. There's 4 different kinds of feedback that we've identified, and we wanted to find out from you, which kind of feedback do you find yourself using more often than other kinds. The first, of course, is effective, and there should be a little poll there. So this is kind of what your current practice or what you lean towards. Go ahead and vote on which kind you use, effective, descriptive, evaluative, or motivational, and we're going to see how the poll turns out. Looks like descriptive is the winner so far. What do you think, Melissa? Is that about everybody?
Yeah, I think that's everybody.
So descriptive. And I think that's probably a good representation of where a lot of people go. Now, that doesn't mean you're not using one of the other kinds, but it's good to know that there are 4 different kinds of feedback that you can turn to, and we're going to look a little bit more deeply into this. Amy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, we just really wanted you to start thinking about where you generally fall so that you have sort of a self-diagnosed framework to look at the kind of feedback we're going to present and see where it might fit within what you already do.
Excellent. Okay, Melissa, we can go on to the next slide. The goals for our session today are, among others, are these 4: to explore best practices in what we call constructive feedback, best practices to actual student work. So we're gonna work together on a couple examples and see what we can do to help promote best practices. Third, we're going to evaluate examples based on provided rubrics, collaborate to reach consensus on the type and amount of feedback needed. Barney Glaser uses a term that I like in grounded theory called flooded out. And sometimes students can get flooded out when we give them too much too soon or too much feedback. And I think we have to measure what we want to say and what we need to say. And of course, the last one, if you're able to open any of the attachments as we go along, we'll try to turn those over. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who's going to talk a little bit about this quote.
So this is one of my favorite quotes. It just sort of really sets the tone for the emotional connection that students have with our feedback. Churchill always said, criticism may not be agreeable, but it's necessary. It fulfills the same function as pain in the human body. It calls attention to the unhealthy state of things. And that's really what we want to focus on. We need to strike that balance between too little feedback or glossy feedback, I like to call it warm, fuzzy feedback, which may not directionally give the students a place to go to build their skills, to build their performance within our courses and within their professional writing structures. And on the other side, the two extreme, the complete lack of warm, fuzzy, the harsh, critical feedback that can sometimes cause students to shut down. So our focus today is to keep us somewhere in the middle for pointing out what must be pointed out while still giving the students a path forward and making them believe they can indeed survive the process. We had this little video clip. Adobe was not our friend. So when we did this presentation live, there's this adorable clip. It's from the movie Inside Out. And if you ever get a chance, or if you've seen that, you should definitely do that. It sort of shows the emotions in this child's brain. So there's anger and there's calm and there's love, and it that sort of shows how they process every statement made to them, and we included that little clip. You can see she's not happy about the feedback she's getting. So I recommend the movie, but Adobe wasn't our friend for the clip. But it really is today about understanding what we say versus what students hear and how we can give them a concrete path to construct a better path for their writing, for their performance.
Amy, one other thing I might add is it's also good to remember that students often respond on an emotional level first. And so it's important to jump in and sometimes just calm students and ask them, how are you doing, how are you feeling, before, as they get their corrective feedback from you or they get a draft. Check in, do a little check-in with them to see how they're feeling, because sometimes the student may be what we call a cover opposite. They may have a smile on their face, but they're really inside. They look like this child throwing broccoli all over her dad. So take a moment to check on the emotions too. Don't discount those, and see how they're processing things. And then you can even go through the feedback together, or if you can develop that kind of a relationship. But don't neglect emotions, or you're going to have broccoli on your suit.
Good point. So the second handout looks at this full list of strategies, and it is going to be dealt with later in the slide, but you've got a handout that has all 7 of these feedback strategies and the references that we gathered them from. We're going to focus mainly in our short time together on looking at specific targeted areas for feedback and correcting the errors, not the people. But all of these things we'll zip through towards the end are going to be very important to creating a good feedback atmosphere. Doing your pre-work and creating that mutual respect with students. Like Mitch was saying, emotions are very high with graduate students, but particularly with doctoral students. So depending on your work situation, whether you're giving feedback on master's level papers and reflections every week, or whether you're giving feedback on doctoral drafts of capstones and dissertations, emotions are high. They've invested a lot in pursuing this degree. And there are different goals for feedback in each draft, but you have to sort of create that atmosphere with students. And that's going to lead directly into the rest of what we'll talk to today. For instance, to avoid that emotional backlash, I tell the students a little bit about how I give feedback. I post announcements, or I get in the class lounge, and I say, depending on if it's master students, if it's doctoral students, but to my doctoral students I say, you're busy, you have careers. My feedback tends to be pretty straightforward. I don't do a lot of warm and fuzzy feedback. Understand, I love you anyway, but my feedback will be very to the point. I just need you to know what's wrong and how you can fix it. And I always assure them that no matter what I point out, I'm not just signaling, I'm also going to give them a way to fix it. And so I tell them ahead of time. There are some people that might prefer more warm, fuzzy feedback, but if they know that's not generally what they're going to get from me, then they've already accepted, okay, I know what I'm going to get. So doing that pre-work, talking to them before you ever give them feedback on a document, really participating in that student lounge, being active on the discussion boards. If you're in doctoral programs, giving them a call, letting them hear your voice, or recording a video, a Kaltura video that goes in your course, so they understand you're a person and you're on their side. That's what we call pre-work. So that's one thing we'll talk a little bit more as we go through here. But you've got that handout that walks through all of these things. We're going to focus on number 2 for a few minutes, a specific defined area. For instance, when I have students send me a draft of their doctoral work, they email a document called Request for Review. And in that request, I have them tell me, what's today's date and what's 14 days from today's date, because I always try to have my feedback done quicker than we're required to, but I need them to see in their brain right off how long it could take. what their target day is for getting feedback. I also ask them, what are you working on? What do you want me to look at? What specific help do you need? Because sometimes they don't need me to tell them what's wrong with sections 1, 2, and 3. They're really only concerned about section 4. And they want to know, did they do that right? And they don't want a bunch of feedback that they're not ready for yet. So I always try and get them also to self-reflect. Where am I in this process? What do I really want this professor to tell me? What do I want to get feedback in? And so we're going to look at a targeted area of student work. Again, if you can open those handouts that say student work sample, we've put a little bit on the next slide, but it's going to help you to see the whole document that Mitch is going to be talking about, identifying and diagnosing some of these problems in a specific defined area of the assignment.
There we go. Take a moment just to read a little bit of this. I don't necessarily have to read it to you, but I'd like you to read this over. And Melissa, is this the slide you have a little place for them to type in?
As far as comments they have?
Yeah.
Yeah, they can just type the comments right in the chat area.
Okay. So let's start with, go ahead and when you see some things, you can use this. If you have the bigger slide or the handout, feel free to grab some content from there. I think it's important as you look at a document that a student's doing to try to look for, start with the topic sentence at the very top. See if any of their paragraphs have topic sentences. That's often a good idea of what's going on. And if they support that topic sentence. And that'll give you some more clues. So maybe I'll ask
participants
just a basic question. Do you find a problem in this? A clear problem statement. It goes on for 2 pages, and this is an actual student example. Let's see what Melissa's finding here in chat.
Yes, so far, Cheryl has identified some good issues, lots of evidence, but not much analysis. Can't really see from this what the paper's going to be about. Series of citations with no original thought. Yes, Sandra, that's a huge problem for our students. We reiterated, Mitch and I were at residency last week, and I kept telling students, I can read the article. I don't need to know what the author thinks. I need to know what you think about what the author says. So there's actually, in the larger work, if you've got the handout, there's lots and lots of things that as an instructor or a chair, you might be pointing out about this. Sandra and Cheryl have found a few, just a series of citations, not a lot of original thought. Anybody else want to chime in? We've got another slide of material to see if we can find some problems in.
You can also identify another key flag indicator. Lots of single source entries dropped in. So you're not seeing a lot of synthesis of thought here. That, like she's combining sources, or he or whoever wrote this is combining sources to bring points across. One of my colleagues calls this the parade of authors approach, where they just parade them along one at a time. That's also another, after topic sentence, that's probably the next thing I look for. Is there any evidence of synthesis?
Well, Amber brings up a good point in the chat box that there's some sentence level errors, but she's not sure if that would be the first priority. And Amber, that's an excellent point. I always use a comment bubble on the front page to sort of give them a hint of what I've looked for and what I've diagnosed. We don't want to ignore content. You get some of those reviews back and there's 117 APA errors identified, but the student doesn't know if they've written a good problem statement. So we don't want to too early in the process give them all the sentence level errors, but we definitely don't want to ignore them. So that's an excellent point. I'll put a comment box on that front page and say, hey, I'm really looking for the alignment of your problem and your purpose and your research questions today, but if I find grammatical errors or I found several sentence errors and semantic errors, and I'm just going to point those out each one time, if you would take my suggestions and look through the rest of your document for those kinds of errors. That way they know, just because I didn't comment on it doesn't mean it was a good sentence. But that's not really what I'm looking for in this draft. So I think it's great to tell them. Or, this time I'm really just going to take a critical eye to your writing, and I'm going to look for all the periods and commas and semicolons in the wrong place. I think all of those approaches are just fine, but to avoid those emotional collapses from students, we just have to tell them. I always use a comment bubble on the first line of whatever I'm grading or giving feedback to, so they know what I'm looking for and what I did and what I ignored if I ignored anything. Because sometimes students say, well, you never pointed out that I wasn't doing that citation right, so it must be correct. So give them a heads up. What are you looking for?
One other thing I noticed about this too, one thought that came into my mind as I was reading it is a lot of this is background information for the problem, but it doesn't really get specifically to the problem. And I know we'd like to see students maybe have some sort of a topic sentence and then get into their problem statement as the second sentence in that section, and then follow up with support and evidence. A lot of this could have been done in an introductory paragraph before they get there, as APA does allow that untitled section, and that's maybe something that's not pointed out a lot by the rubric. It doesn't specifically say if a student is throwing a bunch of pre or background information and have them do it as an introductory section. But that would be another suggestion I would probably give.
All right, can we look and see? Let's look at the next one and see what you all found some good things that you might want to give feedback on. What do you see in this student's perspective document that you might want to point out to a student?
Fire up those keyboards.
That's right. That's what my preacher always says. This is the part where you talk back. Again, if you've got the handouts pulled up, you've got more information to work with. Cheryl says she's not sure what you're looking for. So if you just had the handout student work sample and some of it is reflected on these slides, where would you start? What kind of constructive criticism would you start to give? What errors do you see that you might want to point out to students?
Amy, I have the documents that I can open. Would that be helpful?
Sure.
Yeah, that would be great.
Which
Can
one
you get the student work sample?
The student work sample. Okay, I think it might be this one. Let me know if this is the correct one.
Yes, there we go.
It's the second paragraph now that we looked at the first one. Now we're looking at the second one.
Melissa, I'm having trouble seeing the chat. There we go.
Amy
says she might point out the writer seems to be assuming the reader knows what the local setting is. Lots of evidence again, Cheryl says.
Just for those that are seeing this on the webinar, you can pull that document up and down to see further down if you want.
Yeah, this is actual student work that was submitted to us for approval of a perspective for an EDD project study.
I'd like to call out one sentence that in that document. It says, anecdotal conversations with teachers at Peach County School indicate that there is an immense problem, period. And then, for example, social studies teachers state that their classes for ELLs can be difficult because students have to learn both social studies and English at the same time. And then she talks about a major concern for teachers, and then goes on and on. So even though there's an immense problem, it's hard. She never says it. And Amy talks about emotional terms. I think if I was to put a word on this, it would be this is a persuasive document. It's bringing forth evidence for something and trying to show her side of the argument.
Cheryl says the point of view isn't stable from teacher or from student. Good point. So there's lots of things, bless the student's heart, that just didn't go right. So then we have to decide, what do we say and how do we construct feedback that will correct them and give them a path forward? Because that's really our focus. I love those commercials that are out these days where, for instance, the bank robbers break in and they look at the security guard and say, aren't you going to do something? And he says, oh, I'm not a security guard. I'm a security monitor. I just point out when there's a robbery. And then he looks around and says, there's a robbery. And sometimes I feel like our feedback are that. We just say, there's a problem. And we don't give them that corrective path forward. So that's one of the things we really want to get to today. Can we go back to the slide, Melissa?
I like what Cheryl says the purpose of this paper is. And I think you'll see purpose statements in the problem section when a student runs out of things to say about their problem and they're just trying to grow. And it's important to know the difference between a problem and a purpose. You know, the problem is supposed to be specific to their area, to their, if it's a PhD student, it's addressing a gap in the literature. In EDD, it's addressing a gap in practice. Now, the new dissertation is a little different, but more like the PhD document. But when they start jumping into purpose, you know you're in deep trouble.
Amber points out she might point them to the meal plan for paragraph organization. That's a great transition to where we're headed. If you all can access what's called in the files Handout for student work feedback, again, we're going to put samples of that on the slide, but it's much more effective if you can see everything we've said. What we've done then is take a shot of these things with some of the feedback, certainly not all of the feedback, but some of the feedback that we've given to students like this, and some to this student in particular, framing the feedback in the way that we'd like to talk about. So if you can pull up that handout, it's better than the slide. Melissa, can we pull that up into the frame?
Sure. Is it the same one?
Yes, it's student work feedback, handout 4. We can make it a little bigger because they're not going to chat for a minute. Okay, so some of the things that we've said to them, if we can move that over. And we really want to let
the bubbles over there and zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so for instance, there's my bubble. You know, hi Renee, this review I'm going to focus on the deal breakers from your rubric. However, I've seen mechanical things, I'll point them out the first time, then you can use those to diagnose other occurrences. So for instance, we got a faculty, a colleague of ours, got a review back from a URR, and it had 360 comments on it. Now, I defy you to find a student who can open a document that has 360 comments on it who does not shut down. And that's what we really want to avoid. So there are lots of sentence structure issues, APA issues, some grammatical things in this work, and I'm going to point out the first time or two I see it, but I'm not going to overwhelm them unless this is close to the end of our draft and now we're going for broke. We're going to point out every single thing that's wrong and try to fix it. But I'm going to tell her that in the opening bubble. And then, for instance, the second comment, first person pronouns should only be used to describe your own actions. But then I'm going to insert the link where that's discussed and where that gives her more information about that error. Because instead of just saying APA error, I'm going to point out what that error is and a link to get her more information about that. I think it's important for students to have not only more information than you can really put in a comment bubble or that you care to put in a comment bubble, but it's also important for them to understand that I'm not making this up. This is not my opinion. This is the standard. And we can never go wrong when we point them back to the standard and help them move towards meeting a standard. Then it becomes less emotional. It's not Dr. White against me. It's the standard needs to be met, and here's a website that can help you check yourself. And you
Amy,
can see
it might be a good time to talk a little bit about students that really don't get it. I had a student one time, I pointed out things, and I just keep getting bad. Nothing seems to improve. The student would take quotes and just drop them in and hit the paste button. So I mean, in terms of understanding the use of Word and some of those kinds of things, I couldn't get. One of the comments I made to her was this: your use of dumb quotes is showing up, and dumb quotes. Then I gave her a link to what dumb quotes were. And that's when the quotation marks don't curve. They're just up and down because you pulled them in from another document. They're not. You need to redo them and hit a space bar after it, and then they'll curve like they're supposed to. Well, she used that as evidence that I was calling her dumb.
Oh, dear.
Even with the link there. And at some point you just want to jump up and down and scream that I'm not sure if the student's going to make it. As long as they're enrolled in the program, we don't quit, we don't give up, and we don't stop. But at some point, you have to weigh what they're able to do and revise and how they take your instruction. And do they turn to shame and blame? If that's where they're heading every time you send something, sometimes your only other alternative is to submit lower points for that draft. So I just want to insert that frustration. Everybody has probably experienced it, and we don't like to see our students fail.
And that's another juncture where we should point out that the telephone is still a great tool in an online university. I know I've been with Walden 11 years, and it was, in the beginning, I didn't really realize, sometimes you need to pick up the phone. Just because you can communicate over email and because we are an online-based university doesn't mean that all our communication needs to be online. In fact, quite the opposite. When you're working with students who are stuck or students like Mitch is referring to, the phone is your best friend because then you can hear their struggles. They can hear the empathy in your voice. It's not so critical. It can be more corrective. I know, for instance, and I just had it happen, I had a student who simply was not taking the corrective feedback. We were on attempt number 3, and I kept saying, I'm just going to copy and paste in the comment I made last time because you still haven't fixed it. So instead of that, I just returned the paper with a few comments and said, I need you to schedule a phone call with me. I have some questions about how you are understanding my feedback, and I want to make sure we're on the same page. Please let me know when you can chat. And once I got her on the phone and could articulate to her, you did not do this last time. Why not? It really just, I don't know how students get in that fog of feedback, I call it. But sometimes you have to pick up the phone and find out. Sometimes they have to hear you say, look, I've pointed this out 3 times and you didn't fix it. So now I need to know, do you not understand what I'm saying or do you not understand how to fix it? How can I help? sometimes that is all it takes, that one short phone call, to let them understand what the feedback is meant to do. It's crazy that they don't always address even the very best feedback. But when they don't, pick up the phone. And you'll see the comments that we're scrolling through. And these are, of course, just ours, but they have several of the things we're going to talk about, the I statements. Try to avoid you. You aren't doing this. You didn't write a purpose statement. Instead, it becomes things like, okay, I'm at the end of the first paragraph, and I can't find the problem statement. Help me out. That's different than you did not put the problem statement in the correct place, which is absolutely true. She did not put the problem statement in the correct place. But now it's a matter of, I can't find it, and here's how you can help your reader. So we just wanted to give you some examples for the kinds of things we do when we say corrective feedback. Because not only do I want to be the security monitor, not only do I want to monitor the progress, I also want to give corrective directionality. How can you do this better? By inserting a website or a link for the student. Here, I often use things that have gone on in class to remind them, remember our conversation in the classroom about speaking objectively and avoiding emotional terms. So for this student, there was a whole trend in the discussion board where we talked about this. Don't say teachers are overwhelmed, and students, to speak objectively and use your scholarly writing strategies. And so I just point that back out to her because she's got all that information in the discussion board. So it doesn't matter whether you give them a link to Walden or a link to a video or remind them a discussion you had on the phone or in the classroom. It's giving them that direction to connect with your feedback instead of just pointing out where the mistakes are. It's also a great strategy to copy and paste directly from your standard, whether it's a prospectus guide or a proposal checklist or a rubric for an assignment in an MS Ed class. If there is something that is clearly in violation of that standard, then I don't put it on me, I put it on the standard. I just copy and paste that standard right in there. According to your rubric, you should have done this, this, and this. Let's see if you can accomplish that by the next draft. Pare this down to one paragraph each. So now it's not about her, it's about the standards.
One thing, Amy, I'd like to shout out here, since you made this comment, and how important, I can't tell you how many students have said to me when I've called them about problems with their committees, the chair never has said one nice thing about anything I've ever written. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that statement from students. It's really important that you don't let the clouds of problems overshadow the opportunity you have to find something that you like. And I think, there's important issues, as she points out here, but go through the document again with a different set of glasses on, looking for positive things, and see if you can put a few of those in as well. Don't get overshadowed by the mistakes.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And there's many different ways. Like, we're all different, so we all have different ways of approaching these things. So, for instance, when I return an assignment, I always try to put the most positive things in that little comment box that goes with their grade when I return the draft. So I'll say, I saw a great improvement in problem and purpose. I'm still a little concerned about your conceptual framework and your research questions. I've put lots of comments in the paper for you. I think you're ready to move on to this section. I appreciate how you addressed the feedback from last time. Let's see if we can get a draft in 2 weeks. So I try to only say nice things in that box. But then again, I've told them up front, here's my feedback style, here's what you're likely to get in your comment boxes. So there's lots of different ways to approach it. You have to find the one that works best for you. I've seen some URs that and others, that second members that work on committees with you, that do lots of positive feedback within the comment bubbles. That is totally appropriate. I tend to do it all in one time. Here's the great things I loved about this draft. Open and see all the comments for the things I want us to revise for the next go-around. So find what's most comfortable for you, but absolutely they have to know that they did something right. in this draft, or they're not inclined to go on and use your feedback to correct themselves further. All right.
Some of the points, I think, Amy, that we find frustration in our faculty, too, we might want to point out some of that as well. There's a term in wrestling that I like called tapping out. And this happens when you've done so many revisions. I know faculty that have done 17 to 20 revisions and read them of student work. I'm not sure what the breaking point is, Amy. Maybe it's 17, maybe it's 20, but you get to a point where you just can't take it anymore. And so there's two things that faculty seem to do. They seem to either just approve it and because they've had enough, and they send it through, even though it's not approved in their minds, or they call on the second member. I have had it with this, and that's the tapping out. I've had it with this thing. You need to take a look at it and fix this. I wonder what people think about that. What do you do? And that's kind of where we're going. I'm transitioning to our next slide on sharing insights.
Yeah, this would be a great time if you want to unmute and chat with us a little. What do you see? What do you do when you're at the end of the rope with a student?
And that's illegal, by the way. You're not supposed to approve a document and expect the URR to take over as a committee.
Absolutely. Yeah, that only gets us all in trouble.
Yeah, that has happened, and we've just been through a sequence of some of those kinds of things happening.
Mitch, Cheryl asks, what do you do when the second member taps out as well? Where can a committee go for help if we're talking doctoral work and realizing not everyone works in that world, but when you just can't get through the student and the second just taps out as well, where can a faculty member go?
And I think that's an actual question that you guys can jump in and answer if you have one. I think, Amy, as I was thinking about that question too, we need to know our specialization coordinators. We need to know our full-time faculty, our URR, and others in our division that are helping us. We don't want to just send every problem student to the principal, but I think there is a time when you can bring in the coordinator, or you can bring in someone in your URR, and check with your program director to see if there's some people that would be willing to just take a read of something.
Yeah, I find, and that's a good strategy for everyone at Walden, to find out what your chain is. Who can provide feedback to you in your quest to help students? When you can't get through to them in their course writing, or when you as a committee can't get through to them, what are your options? I'm sure it's a little different for every specialization and every department. In our specialization, there are times when, we get to the coordinator and we just say, look, I can't, I'm on draft 17. The second can't say anything that she responds to. Help. What do we do? Can you take a look at this? How can we better guide the students? As a full-time faculty member, I sometimes jump in and walk alongside a committee briefly to help them get a student on track, sometimes organizing calls between the whole committee and the student with an outside party. We did that the other day, and it was pretty successful because there's sort of that familiarity breeds contempt, and when your chair and second say it over and over, you can ignore it. But when you're all on a phone call and somebody else from the department says, look, I read this too, and I'm confused, so tell me how you're going to address the feedback from your chair. Sometimes it really just takes them understanding that even an objective outside third-party reader doesn't get it. So, that's a great thing to look for in your department, in your little piece and corner of Walden. Where do you go for help? What is your structure? Who can give you guidance if the feedback you're providing isn't effective?
Yeah,
Mitch,
I think John's got a good point. Is persistence enough to receive a doctorate? At what point does faculty tell a student that maybe it isn't happening? And I guess that's a tough one to struggle with. I've never felt as a faculty member working with a student that it's my role to tell them it's time for them to look for an EDS, because they're there to get an EDD, and our job is to give them corrective feedback. Now, after so many times, I think that's where you need to involve someone who should be giving the student those options, and that would be their advisor, that would be the program director, maybe the specialization coordinator. But I struggle with that too as a coordinator when we're talking with faculty. It really deflates students quickly, you know, when you tell them, well, you just don't have what it takes to do this. You would think after 17 iterations they would figure that out, but I don't know, maybe others have an opinion. That's sort of where I land on that one.
Well, and we don't want to drift too far from the mark, but that is part of how feedback and grading go hand in hand, right? So if the feedback is persistent with, this is not it, you've not addressed it, this is not it, this is not it, this is not it, then the points should be commensurate with that. It's frustrating when we get students who come up the chain who say, and we look at their work and we agree with the committee, this is ridiculous. They're not addressing the feedback. They don't seem capable of managing this scholarly writing process. But then we look in their Blackboard course shells and they're getting 80, 90, 100 points every time. So we have to make sure that we use, because grading and feedback are two different processes, but they should walk hand in hand. They should mirror each other. So if the feedback is consistently, you're not getting it, then the grade should reflect that. And we don't want to wander too far off the mark, but we're doing students a disservice by giving them, quote-unquote, credit for work they have not done.
Students see grades, too, as approval. If you give them 80, you approve this draft somehow. And I think we've got to be really careful that we do remember the national statistics that our 50% of these students are not going to make it. That's a national statistic. Now, I think maybe ours is higher.
Ours is higher than that.
At Walden, but we still have to balance our grading. I think that's a really good point. The other thing a faculty member can do is resign from a committee. If you just don't feel you have the stuff it takes, or you have just been worn out by it, at some point we don't want you to lose your mojo either. So that's when you need to bring your coordinator and program director in and just say, hey, this is taking up way too much time, and this student needs more help than I have time to give them. And you kind of have to be honest about that.
True. Does anybody else have anything? I know Ron and John and Cheryl, I see you've chimed in the chat box. Does anybody else have any insights? The kinds of feedback that we modeled on that handout, is that what you typically do? Do you use a different strategy? What do you see that strikes a chord with you about the kinds of feedback we're presenting?
Feel free to unmute yourself and talk to us.
Yeah, talk to us. If nobody wants to talk, then type away, and we'll look at that. There's another handout that Mitch is going to take us through called Criticism versus Correction. So we've just pasted the bullet of that on this slide. You need the handout for all the goodies. But Mitch, you want to talk us through that, and I'll see if I can't glean some things from our participants who are typing.
Thanks, Amy. I put just a basic definition of corrective and criticism. This comes from William Dean's book on his book about correction and criticism, where he says that corrective advice tells the student or person what they need to do or where they need to go to correct behavior. The finger is pointed at the direction they need to go. And with criticism, it tells the person everything that's wrong with what they did, but the finger is usually pointed at the person. And that's where that, and I kind of put this chart together here. It points a finger at the student, criticism does, but correction points them where they need to go. The tone is critical and often demeaning. It can lead to feelings of inadequacy and defeat. A corrective tone should be hopeful and direct the student to what they need to do. And I think, as one of the comments was made, maybe, you'll have students that are going to say, geez, I really need to take a writing course. I really need to do this. I really need to do what you said. Critical, a student is left with the understanding they don't get it, and that their feelings of inadequacy and failure. With corrective advice, it should lead to more questions. How do I get these skills? What do I need to explore? What articles am I not seeing? And sometimes, you can get into a good discussion about, what articles have you read? You've only got 7 current sources. You might want to look at expanding that and seeing what you can get. Even yesterday, I was working with a student that wasn't good at summarizing. I noticed all of her summary articles that she had summarized were really horribly summarized. So I said, let's work on that and focus on that right now and see if we can work on fixing that. So chunk down the work so they can do it. The last one is students are to accept what they're told and often defend for themselves. And unfortunately, shame and blame is a co-journeyer with criticism. And we know students go to their advisors and lay out all the how bad their chairs, and unfortunately also go to other students in their class and talk about that, and can, I call that the toxic student, where they just begin to spread their frustration and toxicity around in the classroom and discussion board and everywhere. Again, scaffolding and differentiation might be needed, and we don't really do formative assessment, but this is an opportunity. This is a formative assessment you're receiving every time they do a submission, and so use that to develop the differentiation that's needed. So those are just a couple ideas I have. You can go to the next slide.
Okay, so we're back to sort of our opening handout on the different strategies. And we'll just walk through those real quickly. If you have things that you do that go under these categories in your classrooms that are different, please type those in the chat box, or feel free to unmute, because we're all about taking each of these best practices and corrective feedback and expanding even our understanding of what faculty can do. So please feel free to chime in. We talked a little bit about doing your pre-work, and that is setting the tone for the feedback they're going to receive and the kind of feedback. And I tell students, here's what I give for feedback. Here's how I generally approach it. If you need something different after you've seen my feedback a couple of times, please call me. We'll talk about how you might understand it differently. So I want them to understand if they have something they really like when they get feedback, that I can at least try to honor that. But set that tone. If they've never heard from you, if you're not active on the discussion board, if you don't have a fun introduction in that class lounge, then you're not a person. You're just pointing out their mistakes. So try to do that pre-work. We've talked about focusing on a defined area of feedback, so I define that in the comment bubble. I also get them to help define it by that request for review. So what do they want me to look at? What are they struggling with? What do they want feedback on right now in this draft? Then accept students for who they are and where they are. It's what Mitch was talking about, that sort of differentiated instruction. Sometimes we just have to do things differently. I have one student who is an international student, and we just have to talk on the phone. It wears me out a little, I'm going to say, but she can do it. If every time I post a draft for feedback, I say, okay, give me a call on one of these days. Then we talk through all the feedbacks, and she's fine. Then she's better. I have other students that they don't ever want to talk to me, like in case something's really wrong. I'll always offer, this was a really good draft, but there's a lot of stuff in the literature review that I still think we need to work on, and I use we a lot because this is, whether you're the instructor or it's a committee and you're the chair, this is a we. We are all in this together. I tell students regularly, it is not any credit to me when you don't succeed. So I'm constantly, saying what do you need and how can we get you there? And in the very end, you have to remember that the minimum standards are the minimum standards for a reason. Sometimes, no matter how hard you push, and I never want minimum as the goal when I'm teaching a class or chairing a committee, but sometimes it is. The minimum standards are that. If it meets the minimum standards, it meets the minimum standards. It might not meet my standards. It might not meet my preferences. But sometimes we just really have to accept where a student is and that this is all, the minimum is all they're capable of. And maybe we keep pushing them and maybe we get more in the end. But those minimum standards for the course rubrics or the MAs or the dissertations, they are the minimum standards, and meeting that minimum is acceptable. So we have to remember that some students are never going to get more than minimum.
I think that's a good point. Amy, that's a great point. But I want to reiterate with our instructors, too, that bringing someone up to minimum standards is not a symbol of failure on their part. You can't personalize the work that your student's doing. Sometimes the best you can do is up to a minimum standard. And
right.
That may not be the kind of student you want to be associated with or sign your name to. But that's a different issue.
Right. And we've talked a little about the next one, teach what's right regardless. Don't get somebody else to do the dirty work for you. I mean, like I have said sometimes before I'm ready to tap out, I have called the second and said, look, it's not good yet. We still have a long way to go. But would you be willing to look at a couple of sections and give feedback in your voice and see if that doesn't strike a different chord with the student? But don't just say, well, whatever. Let's just see if the URR will pass it, or let's just see if. Never do that. Always insist on them meeting at least the minimum standard, even if you have to have a phone call with someone like a URR or your second or your specialization coordinator that can help you see or give another voice to that feedback.
Amy, there's a little trick that I use once in a while with students when I'm frustrated that they're not really they're not addressing the rubric. I have them do an audit, a rubric audit, where they comment on a blank document where they are addressing each of the points in the checklist. And that really can be an eye-opener when the student can't find it in their own work. Then we're also not having to be the gatekeepers here. Let them activate and let them find it in a document. It's a great teaching tool.
Yeah, good idea. That sort of dialogic feedback, we need to fix this, or I can't quite find this, or, have you considered doing this, incorporating dialogue in the feedback, and then pointing out exemplars in the student's own work where you can. So if they're struggling with, let's just say, APA parenthetical citations, but you find some that are correct, then highlight those and say, yes, this is what I'm looking for. Do this every time. Or if they have a paragraph that really presents a concept and is organized well, then highlight it and say, exactly, this is what I pointed out to you in the last few comments. This is the kind of paragraph I'm looking for. This has a great topic sentence. It's organized well. It has evidence. Where possible, point out in a student's own work where that exemplar is. And then correcting errors, not people. And that's pretty much what we've spent most of our time today talking about, giving those guideposts to show them where the tools are located. We have provided a handout for you as well that you can take and use and add to, called the Resources Handout. That aims you at some of the things that you might begin to use in your feedback. So I don't think we need to open that right now. But what I do is I keep, because Walden is vast and amazing. in the number of supportive resources they provide. The only real problem is there's sort of a little bit of everywhere. So if I have a student struggling with lit review, the Writing Center has things, the library has things, the doctoral capstone page has things. So as I'm working through Walden, I keep a resources document, and every time I come across anything, anywhere in Walden that I find useful, I just copy that link and drop it into a document that's organized by, lit review, writing helps, APA concerns, conceptual framework issues, problem statement issues, scholarly writing issues. And every time I find something anywhere at Walden that helps, I paste it in there so that when I'm doing feedback, I can do it much faster. I can copy and paste links much faster. And that's one of the best corrective strategies is, again, to provide a guidepost. Here's where I want you to go to fix it. And so we've provided you maybe a jumping off point in the handout called the resources handout with a few of Walden's resources, things that we use. But we'd love it if you take that and make it your own. What program do you work in? Are there specific journals you constantly are pointing students to in their classroom writing exercises as getting more grounded in their specialization? Are there YouTube videos linked through Walden that you like to use? If you can keep that handout, bookmarks will drive you crazy. I found that out like my first 2 years at Walden because even just trying to organize the bookmarks was craziness. So there's lots of different organizational strategies out there. But Cheryl says Phrase Express. I've heard of that. So there's probably lots of good things out there that can help you minimize the time it takes to give really good corrective feedback. But find whatever those are and use them. We've provided the resources handout for you as a jumping off point as an example of some of the kinds and types of resources we provide to students. But it's yours for the having. I think before we went out of time, we did want to do that last poll.
Yeah, let's do poll number 2. Can you move that one up? There we go. Go ahead.
So of all the things we've talked about today, what are the ones that either you already use in your practice or you're walking away going, oh yes, I'm doing that now. So what are those things?
You can click on more than one.
Yes.
It's interesting how they're growing and activating.
So what we hope is that we live in the world of online feedback, and we hope what we've given you is just maybe some consolidation and articulation of thoughts you already had, or some new directions to look, or some ways to expand the good feedback you're already doing, to help students, or if you are, to help committees find and identify and move forward on these things, because we always want at Walden to be directional. We always want them moving forward in some way. Mitch, I'm going to let you wrap it up for us.
Close that if you wouldn't mind. There we go. On the next slide, this one here, we're really pointing you to our, and I think Amber, I appreciate your link there too. Those links to the Writing Center and different places are on that feedback handout that we provided for you. And take a moment to check out those. It's called the Examples of Walden Resources, but we have writing, literature review, conceptual. We've kind of organized them into the different categories, but that'll give students kind of a big picture place to go to find the resources they need. The most important thing is that we give them direction and don't point or be part of the problem. So we don't want to point the finger at a student. We want to send them in a direction to go. And if those things fail, we meet with the student. Those are the kind of the important takeaways. Next slide.
Is there anything that you want to ask or chime in? You can unmute. You can type in the comment box. I know we're right up against the edge of our time, but we want to make sure if you have any questions or you have anything that you can really add, that you jump in either by unmuting yourself with *6 or by typing in the comment box. We really appreciate you coming, and anything that you can contribute to the conversation is welcome.
I'd like to thank everyone as well, and I'd like to thank Dr. White for joining me.
Well, thank you, Dr. Olson. Dr. Olson and I are quite a pair. We like to work together. We hope that shows.
Well, if there's no other issues, we thank you back. Thanks for all the thanks. And I appreciate many of the colleagues that showed up here. Amber, James Lespina, Martha. I've seen a lot of friends on the call, Dr. Jazar. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us.